All right. Welcome everybody to the Playing Games podcast, episode 16. And today we have a very special guest, Max Coleman. Max, how are you doing today?
I'm so good. Thank you so much for having me, bro. I don't know if I qualify as super special guest or anything, but I'm honored to be here.
Well, I mean, you are a researcher, right?
Yeah,
Well, at least you're in the field,
true.
hands
We're a
on.
dime a dozen these days, though, to be fair. So,
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And everyone's kind of downplaying PhDs now too, which is,
social media PhDs, even.
yeah. But I mean, I don't know. We can get into that later on in the podcast. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we could get into the meat and potatoes of today's topic.
For sure. So my name's Max. My favorite holiday is Thanksgiving. Big fan of Carolina Blue. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Anytime someone says talk about yourself, I get all nervous as to not know what to say. I'm an Aries if people are interested in that. But you probably care more so about what I do for work and how I got started in lifting science and stuff like that. So I started lifting when I was about 12. I've told the story like a trillion times on podcasts. So I'm sorry, mom and dad, the only people that listen to all of my podcasts, that you have to hear this for the thousandth time. But I started lifting when I was about 12 years old, kind of fell in love with it immediately and started noticing that I wasn't, and obviously when I'm 12, this doesn't tell you much, but even later into like 16, 17, I started noticing that I wasn't really progressing at the same rates that you would normally see. Part of that is exposure bias, because you would see people on Instagram and YouTube getting super jacked super fast and you assume that's the norm. But other than that, it was just people that I played sports with were getting jacked quicker than I was. And that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of evidence-based fitness and what have you. And big shout out to Omar Isuf and Dr. Mike Israetel for kind of like really strong arming me into that side of the field. So I got interested in that and then realized that, oh shit, you can actually make a career out of this thing, and ended up switching majors to that from nursing, and then got the unbelievable fortune. I just happened to be at Auburn University, where Dr. Mike Roberts is, and he's an incredible molecular physiologist and does a lot of really, really cool work on both the applied and the mechanistic side of hypertrophy. And then he actually got me in touch with Dr. Schoenfeld, who, and if you're listening to this podcast, you almost assuredly know who Dr. Schoenfeld is, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld is. And I was lucky enough to be able to do my master's under him for the last 2 years, and recently graduated. Actually, I can't say that anymore. So graduated about a year ago now, which leads me to today, where I am basically just training people and making content online about how to get jacked using science. Hopefully that's a quick enough overview and comprehensive enough overview.
That's awesome, because I get the question. Tell us a little about yourself is pretty vague. But I mean, people just end up saying like the right thing that people are most interested in naturally. But so you worked or not worked, you studied at Auburn, right? With
Auburn, yes, or Auburn, you can call it whatever you want, but Auburn University in Alabama. Yep. And I didn't study under Dr. Roberts, because he only really works with PhD students and maybe master students, but I don't think so. But I had the luck and the fortune again to be able to work in his lab. So I helped them with a lot of research there. Chris Van, and Cody Hahn also came through that lab. I never got the chance to work with Cody, but I did get the chance to work with Chris Van, who was doing really, really cool research. He actually did the first study on sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar hypertrophy using low or heavy loads, which was really, really cool. So no, I didn't get to work directly with Dr. Roberts or study under him by any means, but he was like kind enough just to take me under his wing regardless of that.
Yeah, and that's honestly awesome, because if you guys don't know who Dr. Roberts is, he recently, I believe he was responsible for starting or writing that huge paper on the mechanisms of hypertrophy that is like 120 pages long. With like
him and Wakerhaj. I've never been able to pronounce his name correctly. I think they wrote it together, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and they had like they invited like every single researcher, Stuart Phillips, and it was a great paper if you guys haven't read that. But anyway, he's someone that I actually look up to a lot in the field. He's a really cool guy from what I've seen, and yeah, his work is great. And going to Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, what was your experience working under a master's degree, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
How was that working with Brad? Were you really involved? Did you guys do a lot of writing or a lot of experiments? Did you make your own study? Or
So yes to all of that. Working with Brad was it was the I mean I am who I am today. I'm where I am at today because of Dr. Schoenfeld, and that would actually be true even if it weren't for studying underneath him, just because of the seminal work that he's done in this field. He kind of like is the back, but not. I don't want to say this. I don't want to prop him up too much, and because that could then indirectly props me up too much. But he's a beast, and I wouldn't be. This field wouldn't be where it is today without him, and I certainly wouldn't be where I am without studying under him. So, I in the 2 years that I was there, I got my name on about 15 papers, which is kind of insane for a master's program. And that's not a testament to me, but that's just the opportunities that he provided that I was able to do that, which was amazing. So tons of writing, tons of collaborating. I got to basically design my deload study, which was really, really cool. They have an entire class where the whole semester is just you guys culminating and writing a meta-analysis of, which is just, I mean, how many programs do you have where they just teach you from start to finish how to write and publish a meta-analysis, which I think is really, really cool. So it was an incredible experience, insanely hard. Hard, but like grueling. Hours and hours and hours and hours a week, just in the lab, grinding, writing, and then obviously data collecting for anyone who knows what it's like to actually conduct a study. It's a grueling experience for sure. So I have a big hats off to the people out there that are still doing that today.
Yeah, I think that's a honestly very fortunate program to have, because here, like, I don't think any university that I know of has a program like that. I mean, especially having Brad Schoenfeld by your side, someone with such huge connections and who's very well known now. It's honestly pretty cool, because I go to Florida State, so here there's not really a lot of focus on muscle hypertrophy, which is hard. So
how far is Florida State from USF, University of South Florida? Because that's where Bill Campbell's at, and he's got an incredible lab out there.
Bill Campbell, yeah. So he, I think that was, I don't know how far Tallahassee is, but I know I'm originally from South Florida, like the Miami area. He was like 2 hours away, I think.
I think is it in Tampa, or did I just make that up entirely?
No, I think I know there's you know Samuel Buckner?
Yeah, of course. He works at, doesn't he work there? Or did I make that up?
I think he works at USF.
Is that different from where Bill Campbell works? Because I thought that's where Bill Campbell was.
I think there's USF and then UCSF. I got lost.
Yeah, I was about to say, this conversation has certainly divulged away from the topic that we were in.
Yeah, but essentially, yeah, there's two researchers somewhere like in the middle of where I am and where Tallahassee is, like between that area, and they are good. And I haven't been to those universities, but if I ever do go for my master's, I have considered trying over there because of that.
Are you in your undergrad currently?
Yeah.
Oh, dude, you're ahead of the curve, man. You are. That's really cool. I think you're going to go on to do some pretty incredible things. I didn't realize that you were just in your bachelor's currently.
I appreciate it. I mean, I am in my bachelor, but it comes at the expense where I'm a little delayed on graduation. But
it's 2024, bro. No one's graduating after 4 years. You're chilling.
Sure. All right. Well, going off the tangent, let's get into the heavy topic on today's podcast. So there is a study that was released, and congratulations on a great study that we've all been waiting for from Dr. Wolf and Pack, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically, I'm gonna let you hold on to this. What exactly is the study, or what's the name of the study, and what were they trying to measure with the study?
I can't give you the exact name, but it's something like lengthened partials elicit similar muscle hypertrophy to full range of motion in trained subjects. I think that's close enough to get you an idea. And the title right there kind of tells you everything you need to know. So for the last, let's call it 2.5 years, lengthened partials have kind of been like the real buzz. And that's certainly true over the last 18 months. It's really picked up traction. And that's because we had, depending on how you quantify them, depending on how you qualify them, 4 or 5 studies looking at individuals doing a lengthened partial compared to individuals or the other half of their body within subject designs doing full range of motion. And again, depending on how you qualify it, we'll just say 5 for right now. 4 of those 5 showed greater hypertrophy, substantially greater hypertrophy in the arms or subjects that were doing lengthened partials as opposed to full range of motion. And for those of you, for the one person who doesn't know what a lengthened partial is anymore, it's essentially where you do anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of a rep when the muscle is in the most lengthened position. So if you were doing a tricep extension, it would be from when the arm is the closest to the humerus to about halfway down would be a lengthened partial, to give an idea. And so a lot of people have been saying, mainly there's not even a lot of people, but a small minority of people who are very loud have been saying that those studies don't really tell us a whole lot about lengthened partials because they're often done in untrained subjects, which is a common gripe of exercise science studies that is a bit unwarranted. It's kind of unfortunate that this narrative has played out the way it has, but there's nothing inherently different about an untrained subject versus a trained subject with respect to how they're going to train or respond to training, right? Outside of the magnitude of response you'll see, there's no real reason to think that an untrained individual's physiology or physiological response to training would be drastically different, right? But regardless, there's still a gap in the literature to be filled, right? So through the funding from Jeff Nippard, Milo Wolf, Dr. Milo Wolf conducted a study, this study we're about to talk about, on trained subjects, where half of their body was doing full range of motion, half of their body was doing lengthened partials, and the title gives it away, but they didn't see the same, or they didn't see more growth in the lengthened partial group. They saw the same amount of growth, slightly pointing to the idea that maybe these individuals were right, that these untrained subjects, the difference in response to training in untrained versus trained subjects exists. But a lot of people are saying that that's due to sarcomerogenesis stopping after a certain number of months, or serial hypertrophy stopping after a certain number of months. And Juan, I think you probably are more familiar with the true like mechanistic physiology. You're more familiar with that literature than I probably am. But I don't really know where those claims were coming from. And I wanted to be clear that we still don't know that trained subjects or untrained subjects are only getting the benefit from lengthened partials due to this sarcomerogenesis. A bit of a tangent there, or a bit of a ramble there. I apologize, but I can go further.
No, and you're right on track with that. I mean, that's basically what I pretty much spend all my time doing, looking into that, because that was like the start for me into finding out what the rabbit hole I want to go down in with my studies. But essentially, yeah. So the claim comes is that the only benefit you get from doing like a lengthened position, or doing training a muscle at a longer length, or even stretching a muscle like static stretching, is that they're like, okay, well, you static stretch a muscle, the only thing you're going to get out of that is adding sarcomeres, those contractile proteins in the muscle. You're adding them in chain, like in series, and not in parallel, which increases muscle thickness. And they're like, well, like you said, it stops after a certain period of time, which makes sense. I mean, I don't have anything against that, because it's like, well, the muscle can't get long forever.
Well, so that's probably something that we can hash out after the show. But like two things. One, wouldn't serial hypertrophy, wouldn't that increase muscle thickness? Because muscle volume would theoretically be increasing. Not to mention, do we know for sure that the length of the fiber is increasing, right? Necessarily, or is the size of each individual sarcomere being truncated into a smaller space?
Yeah, so the Hornberger lab, which do great work, they made a letter to the editor, and they spoke about this in a couple papers, where it's like, if you increase sarcomeres in series, and in theory, increasing fascicle length could do this too. It can increase mid-belly cross-sectional area. I think it was. I don't want to butcher anything, but I think it was increasing the mid-belly thickness of the muscle.
They said that was impossible?
Yeah. Through like some mathematical modeling, they showed, and it's honestly, you could look at it doing some simple geometry and you could see how that happens. But they essentially, it's like in the if you add longitudinal growth, sarcomeres in series, the middle area, the middle region of the muscle tends to be thicker out of that, out of the consequence of that. But and then if you look at other areas in the muscle, it may not be affected at all. So I think it saying or using that as an excuse for saying, oh, well, we saw static stretching increase cross-sectional area, or this increased cross-sectional area, it's like, oh, it's all due to fascicle length. It's like, well, I mean, it could be, but at the same time, where were those measurements in the muscle? How thick or how much of a thickness was occurring? I think that could relate, because it's also a model. Like, it's not like like this is a.
It's not reality, right? All models are wrong. Some are useful.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, it's a good model, but it's still a model. It's something to look to. It's something to pay attention to. But something that I look most forward to is the strength increases, because increasing sarcomeres in series doesn't really add any strength benefit. And we have seen strength increases far more to account for than just blaming it on increasing sarcomeres in series. But that's pretty much like the hassle of that. And they just think that if you train muscles at a longer length, it's going to increase sarcomeres in series, and that's going to stop. I'm curious on what you think if the muscles can get longer for over a certain period of time. But they think it plateaus very quickly, which I think is only based on 2-3 studies. And I think a couple of those are on assumptions, because they don't have the actual technology to look at that. And again, we could talk about this for hours.
Yeah, that's what I say. This might be something to leave for after the podcast, but it is.
Yeah,
it's very complex, and I think that individuals like Paul Carter, I hate to name drop or anything like that, but I think that they try to simplify it. The one of those Einstein quotes that Einstein probably didn't say or whatever, make it as simple as possible and no simpler. I think that unfortunately Paul Carter might be taking it a little too far and making it simpler than as simple as possible.
Yeah, I generally do think it. And I mean, that when I saw that, I used to look up to Chris Beardsley, and I'd see what he does, and no disrespect, I mean, he does great work, and being able to write articles like that and looking through all that data, that takes time and effort. And I mean, but I used to take what he said 100%. And I think this goes for anybody. Like, you don't want to look at somebody and be like, whatever they say is 100% correct, and you only stick by that person.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes people get angry at, and I talked about this on the Iron Culture podcast, I think people get really annoyed with scientists on social media calling out other scientists. And they're like, what are you doing? Why aren't we all just a unified force pushing in the right direction, right? But that is somewhat antithetical to how this game actually works, right? We need to be calling each other out if we are seeing some glaring issues in someone's models or ideas or hypotheses regarding something. It's good that the Chris Beardleys of the world are out here calling out other individuals. Same with Coach Cass and anyone who's creating noise right now. I think it is a net benefit all in all, but you should never take anyone's word as oak. That's just not how science works at all.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think you should be. It's become popular now that if you ask a stupid question, you just don't ask it or something. Or you get frowned upon for I think asking questions, whether if they're stupid or not, I think that could be subjective.
At one point, it was a stupid question to ask if the sun revolved around the Earth as opposed to the Earth revolving around the sun. So people can go fuck themselves if they get mad at someone for asking a stupid question. I think that's the most ridiculous thing ever, and insanely ascientific.
And I mean, coming from somebody who is relatively slow, and I get that a lot from my friends. It's maybe on social media, it's like, oh, this kid's probably really smart. It's I'm very slow. It takes me a while to comprehend something. So it's if I ask a question that comes off as stupid first, I go back 2 weeks later, and then I look at the question again. I'm like, that makes a lot more sense. But it took me a while to kind of be able to comprehend that in my head a little bit. So if you ask something simple about volume that everyone should know about, that's nothing to be ashamed of.
Not to mention the Zach Robinson et al. Just pulled into question how maybe we have oversimplified how we've been looking at volume. So these questions, again, not stupid. And also, you might be slow, but that doesn't say anything about your intelligence. I was actually just having this conversation with someone the other day. I think we kind of overvalue someone's rapidity or speed to understand things as their degree of intelligence. Whereas you give someone any amount of time to think. Like, for instance, was it Isaac Newton that basically he locked himself away for 18 months and came out the other side with calculus? Certainly that takes a long time, but I don't think anyone would say that he's stupid because it took him so long. You know what I mean?
He did invent, or he came up with calculus, I guess, right?
Invent, discover, depending on how you kind of approach the whole did we invent or discover math question.
Yeah, that's a whole philosophical discussion. But I mean, yeah, essentially this whole concept, going back to the paper.
Yeah, you're gonna have to reel me in the entire episode, dude. I do apologize, but I'm a big
you're
known
fine,
for
you're
rambling.
fine. I kind of like going on tangents. I hope that people like it too. But I know they appreciate the discussion because I'm glad everyone's going into the scientific and nerdy things. But going back into like the Chris Beardsley stuff on when he talked about sarcomerogenesis, that was kind of like the one thing where I read it and I was like, this feels too simple. And by that time, I was already more familiar with physiology. Beforehand, I didn't really know much. And then that kind of brought me down this whole rabbit hole and looking into it and just reaching out to researchers and other people. And they're like, we can't have these conversations. Like, we don't have technology for this. This is way too simplified. There's a lot of contentions going around. And it kind of just opened my eyes to the broader aspects. It's like you have like the social media people and then the and you know, that doesn't discredit people for anything, but you have like the people who try to start things and the people for views. And once you get into like the PhD people who actually are in the research, who own laboratories or have laboratories, and they don't really post a lot because they don't have time, nor they don't care. It's not easy up there. It kind of just opened my eyes where it's like, this isn't as simple as it's thrown around in social media.
Yeah, like the more I think I heard Lane Norton say this on someone's podcast. He was basically like, the higher up this individual is in their expertise, the less likely they are to give you absolute answers. Like, you're not going to hear many PhDs give superlative statements. Like, for instance, I don't think that Dr. Schoenfeld would ever say this is the best exercise or this is the only exercise or anything like that. And which is good and annoying because those the people that are the highest up are the people that we want us to give us the most clear answers, but they are aware of how unclear these answers actually are, right? I think people often tend to take way too of a myopic view. I don't know if that's the right way of saying that, but I do think people try, and I get it, as someone who's trying to make reels on Instagram, trying to distill an incredibly complex topic. Like, for instance, I made a deload reel recently, something that I spent, 18 months working on my thesis for deloads, and then I tried to distill that down into a 60-second reel. Like, of course, that's not going to be as nuanced as it possibly could. So I get it, but again, rambling. Sorry. There are so many things that we don't know, including unknown unknowns. So I don't think that we can confidently say anything regarding sarcomerogenesis or serial hypertrophy with respect to untrained or trained lifters.
Yeah, I don't know how that applies to, at least in resistance training. I know there's papers showing the sarcomerogenesis occur in resistance training, and I think Brad and Martino Franchi, who does a lot of work on this, also wrote a paper saying that like the evidence isn't clear. And there is one, in humans at least, in animals it's clear. And then there is one paper, it's kind of old, where they did actually show direct evidence of serial sarcomere number, but it was through surgery. I forgot the name. It was through surgery, an insane surgical procedure of, I think it was a girl, and like one of her femurs, she was in an accident or something, or like she had surgery, or she needed surgery, and one of her femurs was shorter than the other, and then they kind of like, or not femurs, one of the, I don't know, I completely forgot. But essentially, they transferred the tendon, they extended the tendon to a larger portion of the body, I think, and then over time, very quickly, they saw that she had a sarcomeres in series, and I think it was direct. It was a very invasive procedure, which is how they were able to tell that serial sarcomeres were added. And then they did some mathematical thing, because serial sarcomere number is, I forgot the equation. It's like fascicle length over sarcomere, whatever. I wasn't prepared to have this conversation.
It's okay. But it's okay.
Essentially, back to the lengthened partial study again. The idea of having a hypothesis or a theory, I still get kind of iffy about when I should use those words. It's not bad. And I think if people were to go around saying that I hypothesize or I theorize that, lengthened partials don't cause hypertrophy in trained individuals, and you give some physiological reasoning, that's fine. But and then if you go out claiming or stating that this doesn't occur because we know the physiology, I think that can cause a little more damage than good, because now then people start parroting that and they go, oh, well, we know this. We know this. Like, you just don't listen. These people were always right.
To get just a bit more cynical on that, because and I promise I'll stop interrupting you in a second, but like, yeah, I agree that the Paul Carters of the world saying things very definitively, we know that lengthened partials don't cause any additional growth in trained lifters because X, Y, and Z sarcomerogenesis in trained individuals. I do think, and like I was just saying, I think that it's good that scientists call each other out, but that is not good. One, he's not a scientist, and two, he is ultimately bastardizing science, which, this is going to sound so cynical and existential, but it ultimately leads to things like vaccine deniers or flat earthers who ultimately get a distrust in science because individuals such as himself are misrepresenting what science actually tells us and what science can tell us given the current evidence and current technologies that we currently have. So I agree that it does more harm than good. I want to make that very clear.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that helps reel back into the lengthened partial study on I think Brad made a post saying that physiological reasonings or explanations are valuable, but at the end of the day, nothing beats the mechanistic results from a paper or something like that. I don't know if I butchered that a lot.
I think you're right. I think that mechanisms are great and incredible, and they give us really, really good ideas of what randomized controlled longitudinal training studies we should design. But the evidence that we get, the longitudinal pragmatic evidence that we get from those studies, just tends to be better, right? I mean, we have all these mechanistic reasons why the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity would work really, really well, but the longitudinal evidence we have just doesn't support it. And the energy balance model of obesity, or whatever it is, I'm short pushing in that, is clearly what's actually causing the issue, right? So
yeah, you can make a physiological explanation for anything. Like, I could go really in depth, and I think when people do that, they tend to kind of overstate something that is physiological, but they overstate it. Or they overrate it, I guess. It's like, yeah, that does happen, but in reality, it's not that big of a deal, or it doesn't really affect anything much. One of the reasons could be like the overhead, like the leverages of the elbow and stuff like that. When you're overhead, it's like,
yeah, just golly, man, I'm so sorry. You got to tell me to shut the fuck up at some point. People are often talking about why that study wasn't super valuable because of angling positioning with respect to where the elbow was and the axis of rotation was with respect to the cable. I don't know where people are getting that idea from, because we don't know for sure where people were standing in relation to the cable. We have one picture of one sample model subject doing it. So I'm so sorry.
That was the Mayo study.
I think it's Mayo, dude. So this is so embarrassing. I am a researcher. I am a scientist, and I should know scientists' names who conduct the studies that are so valuable to us. I'm so bad at this. And Milo gets so mad at me when we have these conversations because he's like, the Mayo study. And I'm like, Milo, I swear to God, bro, like, just tell me, like, the overhead tricep extension study. You mean that one? And that's what so I think that one is Mayo. But again, I'm terrible with names, and we'll see that going through this conversation.
I'm the same way, at least when it comes to topics. Like, for example, the Sarcomerogenesis topic. Yeah, I write a lot about it, but if I haven't like looked at it in a bit, like I forget it. I don't forget it, but it's like I can't think of it coherently.
I don't know titles or authors' names, but I know the findings and the general methods, and that's how I write studies.
Yeah, and then when you look at it, it kind of just comes back to you right away. And
for sure. Whereas like the Daniel Plotkins and Milo Wolfs of the world, who not only remember the authors and verbatim every word of the study, but the actual PMIDs and DOIs as well. Like those are the true weirdos in our field who can do that.
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of happens especially when you post a lot. By the way, I'm going to add timestamps for this. So just in case if people want to get to the lengthened partial study, they're able to do that right away. But if you guys want to go ahead and listen to this scientific discussion and stuff, feel free. When you post a lot on social media, and I don't know if you experience this too, I kind of go on a rabbit hole on a certain topic that I'm going to post about, and then I go into the next topic. But that doesn't mean I remember everything from that last topic. So if I made a topic about, I don't know, sleep and like nutrition, by the way, I'm not like super impressed on nutrition, but like I know like the basics, and like I could navigate my way a little bit. But I do that. I make a post about that, and then someone sends me an email, or they DM me. It's like, hey, what do you think about this nutrition thing, like that you said last time with this? I'm like, honestly, I have to go back and look. I have to reread, or I have to just look at the paper, kind of skim through it again, and do that, because right now I'm focusing on neuromechanical matching or something like that.
Which we should talk about after this as well.
We will. I mean, we could keep it in if the people want to hear it. Just like,
well, let's get to the actual study, because I do have a meeting at 2:00. So let's definitely discuss what we planned on discussing, and then whatever time we have afterwards, we can have our fun nerd out convo.
Yeah. So the paper, kind of walk us through what the methods were, and then what the results were on the paper, or like what they had the people do, and then what.
Yeah. So it was about 30 individuals within subject. I think we had about 5 drop out. I could be wrong. Don't quote me directly, and I do apologize for my slightly generalized overview of the study. But we had 30 individuals within subject. Half of their body was designated to full range of motion. Half of their body was designated to lengthened partials, right? And we did upper body training twice a week, just general pressing and pulling movements, plus some biceps and tricep exercises. And then we measured strength and hypertrophy following, but before and after, like a traditional randomized control trial, right? Volumes were pretty standard, nothing crazy, and the results showed no difference, both in strength in the length of partial, strength in the full range of motion lat pull down, and in hypertrophy between the two. Triceps ever so slightly favored full range of motion. Biceps ever so slightly favored lengthened partials, but they were not we'll say statistically significant, even though that's not technically the right framework to use, because we used a Bayesian framework as opposed to a frequentist. But let's just say, for people's understanding, there was basically no difference between groups, and it didn't reach statistical significance.
So when you mean, and I think I used to have trouble understanding what statistical significance counts as, because when you look at the graph, you see, I think it was full range was 6.6 and lengthened partials was like 5 point something. And then you see like the full range is like a little higher than the lengthened partial. So like, I think, a regular person would be like, oh, well, this graph is higher. So the full range won. And then there's like that gap where it's like, how is that not statistically significant? How big does that gap have to be? I don't know if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
So again, I don't want to delve into statistical significance, because this study did not use frequentist statistics or null hypothesis statistical testing, which is just what most exercise science studies use. But we're moving towards a Bayesian framework, which is a really, really complex topic that I'm honestly not super qualified to talk about, so I don't want to bastardize it here. Statistical significance just has to do with if your p-value is lower than the a priori determined alpha, which basically has to do with the probability of experiencing a type 2 or type 1 error with respect to like a false positive or false negative, right? So when someone says that it didn't reach statistical significance, that means that the findings, even though let's say that they're 6.5% versus 5.5%, clearly, if you were just looking at raw percentages, the other one's better. But statistical significance gives us an idea of, oh, maybe that difference is actually just due to chance, and it has nothing to do with the actual intervention that we implemented. It's go ahead.
So I was going to say, like, could it be things like genetics or like other factors that could have probably played in that gap thing?
Well, I mean, we could go through this is, I mean, we're talking about the fucking philosophy of science here. We could go through a true rabbit hole of the different things that could have caused those discrepancies. For instance, what's it called? Regression to the mean, differences in measurement error and stuff like that. Genetics, not necessarily, which is actually one of the biggest benefits of things like, no, don't get me wrong, genetics are fucking insanely important. And there's really good studies, really, really cool study out of Stu Phillips' labs looking at this exact thing. But because we used it within subject design, we don't have to worry about genetic differences between interventions, because you act as your own control, right? Like for instance, if half of my body is doing full range of motion and half of my body is doing lengthened partial, I got the same amount of sleep the night before. I got the same amount of food. I'm eating the same amount. I'm sleeping the same amount. My stress levels are the same. So I'm acting as my own control, which gives us a lot of statistical power so that we don't have to worry about things being due to chance, or we don't need as big of a sample size to be sure that things are due to chance.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I know you can. I know the whole statistics and research can get really complex. Which I'm not a statistics person, honestly, which I kind of have to learn to be. I'm more of a calculus person when I went in high school. But anyway, the findings of the study. Were you surprised to see that the lengthened partials didn't beat the full range?
Yeah, I was. So it's funny. I often make the joke that I tend to agree with the null hypothesis, which is to say that like the null hypothesis in any endeavor usually is that there's no difference between intervention and control, which is usually the case within exercise science, right? I mean, you can use like, especially with hypertrophy. I mean, it's an unbelievably forgiving adaptation in that you can use heavy loads, light loads, you can use machines or free weights. You can train 2 days a week. You can train 6 days a week. Doesn't really matter. There's usually not a difference between those interventions, right? So on one hand, I was like kind of expecting no big difference. However, of again the 4 or 5 studies, all but one showed a benefit. So I was a little surprised that lengthened partials didn't beat out full range of motion, but I wasn't just gobsmacked or blown away that there was no difference, because it's pretty common for there to be no difference between groups.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, did you guys? I don't know if I haven't really fully read the paper. The most I've done is skim through it. Did they talk about the mechanisms on why that could be, or they kind of just
touch on them in the discussion, obviously, as to reasons why it might be, but I think that the mechanisms are far less predictive or indicative of the lack of difference than the pragmatic reasons why there was probably no difference between groups. For instance, there's a really, really cool graph, and shout out to whichever graphic designer I think Milo paid to do this. And I could be wrong about that. I don't know if Milo actually paid anyone to do that, or if he did it himself. But there's a really, really cool design that shows the average muscle length of both interventions. And a lot of the studies that have been done previously, the full range of motion group, their average muscle length is far closer to the short side than the long side compared to the lengthened partial group, which is obviously much closer to the like lengthened side of the muscle length. But this study, we emphasized the lengthened portion in both groups. There was a decent pause in the stretch position. Not to mention, Coach Cass has a lot of commentary on the study to give reasons why it might be the case that the lengthened partial group was quote unquote destined to fail from the start. For instance, the implements that we used might have necessarily almost favored the shortened position, which is why, especially one of the hammer strength pressing movements that we did, just given that it works on a pendulum and tends to get harder as you get closer to the top, it's possible that that would have favored the tricep growth, obviously. Not to mention the differences in range of motion were pretty small. Also, as far as just muscle length are concerned, the exercises we did tended to favor longer muscle length in general, or involve longer muscle lengths even within the full range of motion group. For instance, we did a Bayesian curl in both groups, which places the bicep under a deep stretch because you're extending the humerus all the way back. We did overhead tricep extensions, which obviously place a big stretch on the long heads of the triceps brachii. So there's a lot of reasons why there was very small differences between these groups. I don't think we just don't have any mechanistic rationale as to why this might have been the case. Sure, it's possible that the serial hypertrophy thing does stop after 6 months or whatever, but I think it's more likely the case that there was so much of a lengthened bias in the full range of motion group that there wasn't enough of a difference doing only lengthened partials that would have elicited a big difference between the groups, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you brought that up, and Kassim's post too, because I saw his post and I thought it was very, honestly, I generally thought it was a great consideration that he was pointing all this stuff out.
Of course.
Because when you look at it, it's like, yeah, they were emphasizing the Bayesian curl or whatever, but if you look at like the resistance to the cable gets harder more in the mid range. I think, if I remember the picture,
it does, but I think we set the cable height pretty high. which would have negated that issue of the
You think
force
so?
curve. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would have to go back and look at
Yeah.
the training videos, but I think that the cable was set relatively close to hand height, which negates the issues. Well, not entirely, but largely negates the issues of the unfavorable force curve.
Yeah, I have to relook at the pictures again, but essentially it looked like some of like the resistance profiles and stuff like that, like were they all biasing towards the lengthened position? Because it looked like some of them were biased more to the mid to shortened position.
Mm-hmm.
Then like the machines, equipment you guys used, or you guys had, like the hammer strength, that kind of gets heavier in the shortened position. So it was just kind of like some interesting factors that maybe could be considered in the future, or some, some biomechanics, or I'd say just some physics stuff that people can consider. And what kind of, I don't want to say pisses me off, but what people tend to do, they're like, oh, like these researchers, they don't consider this, like these guys don't know anything or whatever. It's like, I don't know if they understand how much goes into research. I don't know if you can walk me through if you guys ever did consider those factors in the hammer strength, or if you guys were too busy focusing on everything else. And because it's a lot of work to consider creating a whole study and paper to make sure everything plays out. And obviously, you can't think of everything. There's going to be some things that you probably didn't think of that another researcher probably points out in the future or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, by the way, is a huge argument in favor of open science and pre-printing studies, is that this is a bit more of a democratic process with respect to peer review. Instead of a journal picking out 2 or 3 quote unquote experts, and we don't have to get into that, to look at your paper, we now have, I mean, thousands of eyes looking at this study and critically analyzing and giving feedback on it, ultimately making for a better paper. So this is a bit of a tangent, but just to say, yes, it's annoying that all these people have thoughts and think that we didn't think of things, and there's a lot that we didn't think of course. But this is why open science is so amazing, because we now have those insights for future studies going forward, right? Yeah, a lot of fucking work goes into making a study, by the way. An insane amount. I mean, we're talking like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of man hours cumulatively going into a single study, right? And we did think about, I mean, we deliberated over which exercises we were going to do for weeks leading up to even finalizing the methods, right? But there's an issue of availability. Obviously, we had access to a hammer strength pressing machine that we used because it's, well, what we had access to, right? And then I don't think we really took into a consideration, and maybe I'm speaking out of term here, because maybe they did, but I don't think that we really went into thinking about the specific force curves of the hammer strength machine that we were using. And again, I could be wrong about that. But with respect to the exercises we were doing, I think we did a good job of making it somewhat ecologically valid, while at the same time we were almost biasing full range of motion by emphasizing the stretch portion in general, right? So basically saying that, like, look, if you're already doing the full range of motion, we kind of wanted to make it as ecologically valid as possible to, like, for instance, the Renaissance periodization crew. Like, they basically have been saying for a long time, like, look, we emphasize the stretch, we emphasize the eccentric, but we don't skip out on the top. Well, looks like that approach is just as good as skipping out on the top and just doing a lengthened partial, as long as you're emphasizing the stretch portion of the exercise, right? So I think that, I don't know if that answers your question entirely as far as considerations for exercises are concerned, but I do think that it provides a somewhat ecologically valid study design with respect to how people are actually training in the field.
Yeah, and I mean, I think availability is important too. I mean, if you go to every gym, they pretty much have a hammer strength press, or some sort of hammer strength machine. But yeah, I mean, if you're in a lab, it's not like the lab is a whole gym with all the equipment of prime fitness machines and stuff like that. It'll be nice.
Really cool study coming out of someone's lab, thanks to Jeremy Etier, using prime fitness equipment, which I think is going to be really exciting. Yep.
Nice. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's expensive too. You gotta be able to afford all that stuff, and if you want to purchase a machine or anything like that, or more equipment, that can get in the way of the expenses of the rest of the study. I don't know. People kind of just forget about that, and they're like, "Oh, well, these guys didn't think about this. Why'd they use a hammer strength?" It's because they only had a hammer strength. Unless you want to pay for a Prime Fitness machine.
Yeah, give me $5,000 to buy this machine for this one study that you're going to spend 30 seconds reading and critiquing. It's insane.
Yeah. People probably haven't even read the study. They probably read Kassem's post, and then they read probably Paul Carter's post or something, and then they're like, "All right, well, that's pretty much all I need to know."
For sure, dude. Like, for instance, started again tangent about just social media being annoying as fuck to actual researchers. After publishing my deload thesis, like the amount of people that were just tearing it apart because it wasn't a deload. We took a 1 week complete training cessation break halfway through a 9-week training block, and we touch on this in the limitations of the paper constantly. Like, look, we know this isn't how people typically deload, but it's a proof of concept study. So if there's going to be an effect here, we can be very confident that there will be an effect with a lesser, we can be, sorry, if there isn't an effect here, we can be relatively confident there won't be an effect with a lesser extreme, right? And people just tore it apart and was like, "You're an idiot. How could you consider this a deload?" And anytime, it's so funny, people often will critique papers by giving the limitations of the paper in a comment section on Instagram. And it's like, if you read the paper, you are parroting the limitation section of the paper where we talk about all these things that you're discussing. But we can't, one study is never going to give you all the answers, right? You can't have one perfect study that tells you the answer to any question, really.
Yeah. And speaking of the limitations too, I think people they sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes there are some small limitations that people tend to make them a much bigger deal than they are. They're like, "Oh, well, they didn't do this, and therefore this caused like a domino effect on everything else." It's like, well, that is a limitation, but it's not that important, or it's not enough to kind of like discredit the entire paper, put it that way.
Of course.
But so in terms of the evidence that we have now for lengthened partials, I think this kind of shifts the graph a little bit on maybe they don't have as big as an effect that we thought they had. For me, I kind of personally think that I'm not very conclusive on anything. All this study tells me is that the lengthened position seems to be pretty important in a rep. I don't know how much the concentric portion is or how important the shortened position is, but whether lengthened partials are much more, can cause a lot greater growth than full range or shortened position. I don't think we have enough evidence to say that, but I mean, I think with the evidence that we do have, it does look like the lengthened partials have some sort of favor to that. I don't know if you want to kind of clarify.
Yeah, man, I think that the evidence is still pointing in the direction of the lengthened portion of an exercise being incredibly important, right? Like, depending on how you frame it, right, which people are having a big issue with how we're framing it, but like, you could say including the shortened portion of an exercise adds no additional benefit to muscle growth, which seems to be equally as true as saying lengthened partials are equally as effective as using a full range of motion, right? And not to mention, like, I don't want to harp on this too hard, but like, we have now 5 again or 4 studies looking at lengthened partials, or sorry, 5 or 6 studies looking at lengthened partials. 4 of the 5 or 5 of the 6, depending on how you quantify, show a benefit to show no difference, right? But we also have a lot of data, not on lengthened partials, but just on muscle length training, right? Seated versus lying hamstring curl, Nordic versus seated hamstring curl, leaning back on the leg extension, interset stretch calf raises, the all of the Warnicki studies where they're just stretching the calves, right? The overhead versus tricep push down, like. So not to mention the one in trained. So every single study I just named was on untrained subjects. So let me just name one on trained subjects. Ryan Burke et al. His new study looking at seated versus standing calf raises. There's actually 2 studies on this now showing way more growth in the gastroc using standing calf raises. And we don't necessarily know that this is the case, but one of the only differences there is that the muscle length is longer when doing standing calf raises, right? So there's so much pointing in the direction of the lengthened portion of an exercise being really, really important that its inclusion and its emphasis, I don't think should be overstated or can't be overstated. It clearly is where the most bang for your buck as far as hypertrophy is concerned. So this study doesn't really change a lot for me with respect to doing lengthened partials in my own training and that training of my clients, right? The one thing I will say is that, and this is more logical rather than empirical, so I can't cite any studies here. I would imagine that lengthened partials are still going to matter most in the muscles that have the inverse force curve or inverse strength curve to most muscles. So to give like an example of what I'm talking about, right? When you fail a bench press, you're already failing at the most lengthened portion or very close to the most lengthened portion, right? When you fail a tricep extension, you're usually already failing at the most lengthened portion, right? However, when you're failing a calf raise, or when you're failing a bicep curl, or when you're failing a lat pull down, usually you're failing that really close to the most shortened position of that muscle, right? So exercises and muscles that tend to be the hardest in the most shortened position, those are the ones that I think will favor the most or benefit the most from doing lengthened partials. So like if you don't like lengthened partials, you don't have to do them. There might not be a huge benefit to them, especially if you're already emphasizing the lengthened portion of an exercise. However, certain muscles like your back, like your biceps, like your calves, they probably will stand to benefit from a little bit more lengthened focused work because they're already emphasizing the shortened position in most of the traditional exercises that you're doing. So this study didn't change a whole lot for me, is my very short answer to my very long answer that I just gave.
I think those are some good points. I mean, for me, it kind of just showed me that from a practical standpoint, if I like doing, well, I'm gonna bring back the hammer strength press. When I do that one, I tend to really feel my triceps at the lockout position. And sometimes I prefer to just load it up heavy and just do like the bottom portion. So if I do that, I know that the benefit of it could very much be the same as just doing the full lockout thing, and I could just take away my triceps or anything, just from a personal preference. So I think from a practical standpoint, it does things like that, which I think has some value for people. But that to me is probably like one of the takeaways for this, other than the length of position seems to be important. I wouldn't completely rattle it away saying it doesn't benefit trained lifters.
No, yeah, of course. Sorry, one. I want to steelman myself for just a second, real quick, regarding why I don't think you should avoid the shortened position in some instances. For instance, there was a recent Menno post about a study. This isn't even a preprint of a study. It was just an abstract of a study that was presented at a conference. Right? Hold on one second. Basically, there's so many unknowns here with respect to length and training that, for instance, we don't necessarily know if all muscles are created equal in this regard. So, for instance, this abstract that Menno posted basically showed that incline curls were better for growing the brachioradialis, and the brachialis, as opposed to the preacher curl, was better at growing the biceps brachii. And this actually, I want a little tip off my hat to myself here, because I've been saying this for a while, that I would like to see a bicep study with MRI looking at all three elbow flexors, because it's possible that certain muscles are more active at different ranges of motion, right? So for instance, I don't know, for those that can see, actually, I don't want to see. Let's say that the bicep is more responsible for bringing the forearm to 90 degrees, and then the brachialis and brachioradialis are more responsible for bringing it from 90 degrees to 150 degrees of elbow flexion, right? Therefore, if we want the biggest elbow flexors possible and biceps by proxy, we should not be skipping out on the end range of motion there. And the same could be true for certain muscles in the deltoid or certain regions of the deltoid. For instance, a lot of people are really on the only doing lying lateral raises or only doing like cable lateral raises with the cable set to the height of your hand to make the lengthened portion more challenging. But it's possible that certain portions and heads of the deltoid are more responsible for terminating the exercises as opposed to initiating it, right? And the same could be said for the back. Like it's possible that like maybe your teres major is more responsible for finishing a lat pull down, and the lats are more responsible for initiating it, right? So again, I just wanted to steel man myself so that someone couldn't point to this podcast and say, look how fucking stupid this guy is who is putting all his chips into lengthened partials, when in reality, we shouldn't have been doing that, right?
Yeah, and I think that nicely leads into, I guess, the final conversation that we can have about a mechanism of these results. With that, with the results of this and the incline curl study, is that they're like, well, this all pretty much just comes back to neuromechanical matching, and it all relates nicely. Well, before I say, I know I talk a lot about neuromechanical matching,
which is
but
okay. I wasn't rolling my eyes at you, no, just to be very clear.
no, but I mean it does. It's difficult because in a way it does come back to it, but part of me is still skeptical of it. And I could explain what, but I'm curious on what you think about that whole thing, and if you really think we could kind of put all our eggs in that basket.
So do I think we should put all of our eggs in the neuromechanical matching? Is that what the question is?
With that, and what do you think of the whole thing? Like, do you think there's enough evidence for it?
I'm not really sure what neuromechanical matching is. Does neuromechanical matching, and this just shows my ignorance on the topic, does that have to do solely with sarcomere length and like actin and myosin crossover, or does it also take into account the muscle tendon unit as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
But does it take into account size of muscles?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So they so the size of the muscle has a big influence on its moment arm.
Okay.
And pretty much it just in terms of neuromechanical matching, everyone just looks at the internal moment of the muscle. So and the hammer strength press, they're like, well, the hammer strength is more tricep biased because it's hardest at the top, and the triceps have their greatest internal moment arm when the elbow is kind of near extension. That's why you feel your triceps more. And I'm like, well, can't you just say you feel them more because you're actually extending it? It's harder to extend, which is something that the triceps do, and it's in the shortened position, so you get like a higher sensation of it.
Let's also acknowledge that the sensation you feel in a muscle tells me virtually nothing about the effectiveness of that exercise.
Yeah.
Like, you feeling your triceps more does not tell me. And you know what exercise you feel your triceps in the most? The tricep kickback, which, like, who the fuck is going around saying the tricep kickback is the best exercise for the triceps? But, sorry. Okay. I will pontificate or postulate or whatever the right word is with respect to neuromechanical matching. I think one of the biggest flaws of neuromechanical matching is that we assume that just because it's well leveraged and, let's say, contributing to the action of that muscle, that necessitates the fact that it is going to respond better and grow more from that, right? That's generally the idea behind that. Am I correct?
Yeah, simply put, yeah.
Then one of the issues is, and I all credit to Daniel Plotkin, DPD Plotkin, Danny Boy Plotkin on this, because he was talking about, and he just came up with this on the spot to give you an idea of how fucking smart this asshole is.
This guy's a genius.
It's not fair, dude. It's not fair. And I have to do a podcast with him to basically demonstrate how stupid I am all the time so he can demonstrate how intelligent he is. It's infuriating. I love him to death. But he was talking about the fact that neuromechanical matching, one of the issues is that for biarticular muscles, like, for instance, the rec fem in the squat or the triceps long head in a bench press, if you look at their sarcomeres, they're shortening on one side and lengthening on one side, or not necessarily the sarcomeres, but well, yes, necessarily the sarcomeres. But that would theoretically equate to a stasis of the actin and myosin overlay, right? Because if they're lengthening on one side and shortening on one side, and they're theoretically equal, you're remaining at a relatively neutral muscle length with respect to that exercise. And yet the rectus femoris, and it doesn't grow jack shit from the squat, nor do the hamstrings, which could also work with this analogy, and neither does the long head in pressing exercises. So that is at least one contention to neuromechanical matching, necessarily telling you that that's predictive of muscle growth. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
So hold on, I'm trying to process what you just said. So are you saying that in a squat, it kind of stays at an equal the rectus femoris?
So the rectus femoris, right? Neuromechanical matching has to do with the both the sarcomeres and the muscle tendon unit, right? And all of the vasti muscles, right, when you do a squat, are lengthening, and then shortening, right? Which theoretically putting them in a less advantageous position to produce force and therefore contribute to that exercise, right?
Well, okay, I think I know where you're going with this. So I think so you're saying that because the muscle is in a shortened position, it can't produce that much force or whatever, and it can't be that efficient. Because if that's the case, the people behind this, they they all kind of just look at the internal moment. That's it. Now they do talk about the length tension relationship in terms of efficiency.
I thought that the neuromechanical matching had both to do with the muscle tendon unit and the sarcomeres. Is that wrong?
I don't want to say it's wrong. I just keep hearing more about the internal moment arm. The most thing I've heard about the length tension relationship on this is that the brain kind of look. It's a principle about efficiency. So they in terms of the length tension relationship, passive tension is being ruled out because they cited a paper which shows that the brain doesn't consider passive tension um, as part of the efficiency process, or like it doesn't consider it as a source of efficiency or something that it can kind of go to or factor in. Which, by the way, I don't think that paper proves that. I think that the environment that they use doesn't translate well. So I don't even know why they're citing that paper. I promise you, the people didn't even read it. But essentially, now they go to active tension. So it's like after active tension. Well, the length tension relationship uh, is important, and in terms of that, it wherever the muscle has the most cross bridges or whatever, it produces the most force. So that's kind of where we want to train it. I'm not completely familiar with the whole and I've listened to all the podcasts from Chris Beardsley and Paul Carter, but I'm not completely familiar with what they say. I think Chris Beardsley said that wherever the internal moment arm is, the length of the muscle will kind of naturally follow that. I could be butchering that, but when you're talking about the muscle tendon unit on the sarcomere length relationship or whatever, are you trying to correlate when you talk about that? Are you relating that to the internal moment arm? That's basically
So I was not. I was simply using the sarcomere length and the crossover between actin and myosin to negate the theory behind neuromechanical matching being a good predictor of hypertrophic responses to resistance training. But now I'm hearing that maybe sarcomere overlap isn't a big influencer of this. Is that necessarily the case? So let's get away from that real quick one, because I don't want to. I'll pose another argument, and maybe you can tell me if this is silly as well. But let's say like the seated hamstring curl, right, showing greater muscle growth than the lying hamstring curl, right? Wouldn't we theoretically be hindering that muscle's ability to produce force because we're lengthening it pretty drastically on one end? So wouldn't the one muscle that doesn't cross the hip, like, or let's take the sartorius, right, that grew more when in a lengthened position versus a seated, right? Wouldn't it grow more from doing a seated hamstring curl, given that it has a more favorable ability to pull? Like, is that not an argument against neuromechanical matching, or is that again just demonstrating my misunderstanding of neuromechanical matching?
Well, I wish I was I kind of skimmed through the topic a little bit more because I do have notes on this. I wrote notes when they were talking about the length tension relationship on this. My brain is like frying up right now because there's so much about it. Because right now I was looking at the history of it. But are you trying to relate to it with the line of pull of the muscle, where it's like it's a better alignment to kind of pull on the?
Well, yes. So I guess I'm basically saying that like neuromechanical matching has to do with favorability to efficiency with respect to both muscle size and where the tendon inserts on the bone by which that muscle is acting, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that we're not changing the muscle tendon unit when in a lying versus seated hamstring curl distally, but proximally we are, which should theoretically have an effect on the muscle's ability to produce force, no?
Yeah.
So if that's the case, why would a seated hamstring curl show more growth in the biarticular muscles that are lengthened when you're seated, as opposed to lying, if we're giving them a less favorable line of action by stretching them on one side?
Yeah, and I think what the people would respond to you on that is they I know Chris has wrote articles on what you've said and the length tension relationship. I just don't remember them off the top of my head and what his argument was. But I know what I do remember is that he doesn't correlate line of action with the internal moment arm of the muscle. He thinks that the line of action is, or muscles that are like very, especially like pennated and have a lot of directions. There's multiple lines of actions that have to be accounted for, and it just doesn't translate to the internal moment arm of the muscle, which I kind of gave a kickback to that. I was like, I think in mechanics, you can turn everything to resultant force, and same thing, you can do the same thing with muscles. But the key is just trying to find out, or the difficult part is just trying to find out what line of action best represents that. But in terms of that, if the muscle has the greatest leverage in comparison to the other muscles around it, then it's said to be recruited the most. So in terms of like the leg extension, where it's like, oh well, the femur, or the rectus femoris. That was loud.
What
The
was
rectus
that?
femoris. I think that was a motorcycle.
Okay.
The rectus femoris loses leverage when the leg is, lengthening or whatever. So it's like, oh, well, it loses leverage. It's like, what's the only muscle that's extending the knee? So the brain kind of has to use it. So maybe that could be going on with the lying leg curl. I don't remember the moment arms of each of the hamstring muscles off the top of my head. But if it has the greatest moment
arm,
arm,
tell you that much. I have no fucking clue what those are.
If it has the greatest moment arm compared to the other muscles, then probably, because they say that the muscle has to have the best leverage in the lengthened position in order for it to benefit from stretch in order for it to benefit from stretch mediated hypertrophy. Because if not, then it won't be active, which I think is ridiculous. I think a muscle will be active even if it has poor leverage. But
yeah, I can't even like speak to this anymore because it's kind of like an amorphous blob of what neuromechanical matching actually is. I think I'm a bit confused. I would need to hear more so from those guys, like why they think that this is the case, because I don't quite understand.
Yeah, I was writing. I'm like I put an article to the side of it. I was really looking into this, but I threw it all to the side recently because I'm putting more of my effort in my school.
Good for you. To give you a very short answer, Juan, no, I don't think that we can hang our hats on neuromechanical matching being a good predictor of hyper. But let's find something to close on here.
Yeah, sure. So I guess to end everything off on like our little science talk, and I would pretty much I was gonna name the title of this video "Lengthened Partials," but I think this just became a talk about science, which I think is fun. I think it was really cool. What do you think the future could be like for studies like this? Do you think this study was the end all be all? And I know you touched about this a little bit in the past. Do you think the study was like the end all be all? Like we have all the evidence we need to support that muscles don't benefit from lengthened partials, and maybe there are future papers that you guys are working on to follow this up or anything?
So no, this study is there will never be a study that's the end all be all for any topic. That's just not how science works, right? I don't think that this gives us a clear picture with respect to if lengthened partials only work. I mean, we tested the biceps and triceps, y'all. I mean, there are a lot of muscles other than the biceps and triceps. Now, those are the most important ones. Who cares about anything other than arms? Don't get me wrong. But there are a lot of other muscles to be studied as just one limitation, right? But I do think there's a really cool study coming out it'll be a while. But I have a dear friend who might be working on a really cool study looking at both the mechanistic and pragmatic sides of range of motion, right? So I think that's going to be a really, really cool study. So no, there's a lot going forward. Just to tie a bow on the whole lengthened partial thing. If you want to use lengthened partials, you can. They aren't going to hurt you. That is the one thing that we can be relatively confident about given the current state of literature, is that lengthened partials probably aren't going to hurt your training. There seems to be a lot of evidence pointing towards that the lengthened portion of an exercise is not only the most hypertrophic, but there's something uniquely beneficial about including it in your training. You don't have to do it, but if you're not going to use lengthened partials in any of your training, just make sure that most of your training emphasizes the stretch portion of an exercise at the very least. The muscles that seem to benefit, or in my opinion, logically, not rationally or empirically, to benefit the most from it would be those muscles that have a strength curve that descends as you get closer to the end range of motion, shortened range of motion. So for instance, your back, your biceps, your calves, they will probably benefit more so from lengthened partials than, let's say, your triceps, chest, or other muscle that I can't think of right now. I think that is all I have to say. Probably shouldn't throw out end range of motions entirely, because again, it's possible that certain muscles are more responsible for terminating exercises. Again, to give the biceps example, it's possible that your brachialis and brachioradialis are more involved in ending elbow flexion from 90 to 150 degrees, whereas the biceps brachii might be more involved in the 0 to 90 degrees example, right, or portion. So don't throw out range of motion, full range of motion altogether. But if you bias almost all, if not most, of your exercises to lengthened partials, it's probably not going to have a huge negative effect on your physique at all. Boom.
Awesome. I think that's a practical takeaway from all the yapping that I kind of
you cannot take all the credit for the yapping, bro. I went on my fair share of tangents here.
Nah, but I mean, I hope I had a fun time. I hope people probably benefit from having or hearing this conversation, that we should talk about more a little bit on the social media science and stuff like that. But Max, thank you very much for joining on the podcast, and we hope to have you on in the future. And if any new papers come out, or if you come up with a new maybe deload study or anything, and I'll gladly have to hear you.
I will not. I'm done with deloads for a while. But dude, thank you so much for having me. I had a fucking blast. This was awesome. Anytime I get to not only talk about lifting, but talk about like kind of the philosophy of science, which is a little bit more of what we spent our time talking about today, I will take the opportunity to do it. So thank you so much for having me on, man.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could have a new call that we do go more into philosophy, or maybe you go more into philosophy. I'd love to hear more about it. But I'll make sure to link your where people can find you down below. I don't know if you want to say where they can find you on social media, if you know your tag or anything that they could look up.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes. But Coleman et al. On Instagram and TikTok and YouTube, and I basically only post on Instagram if I'm being completely honest. But that's where you can find me.
Yeah, I'll make sure to link that down below. And if you guys have any questions, just comment them down below. And if you want more elaboration of what I said on things like the sarcomerogenesis and neuromechanical matching, if you comment them down below, I'll respond better because I'll be more prepared. But again, Max, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.